Hello and welcome to the Energy Policy Forum. Today we'll be discussing energy security and have a great lineup of speakers. My name is Drew Combs and I will be moderating this event. Justin Pollard will be representing Dr. James Griffin, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Texas A&M University, and his book, A Smart Energy Policy, an economist's prescription for balancing cheap and clean and secure energy. We are also fortunate to have Beod Ebdafar and Lee Johnson with us, representing Dr. Gal Luft and Ann Kwon, who are co-directors of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security and their book titled Turning Oil into Salt, Energy Independence Through Fuel Choice. To round out our esteemed panel, we have Katie Gaspara. She will be presenting on Dr. John Deutsch, former Director of Central Intelligence and Deputy Secretary of Defense, now an Institute Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The discussion will focus on his book, The Crisis in Energy Policy. Welcome panelists and thank you for attending this forum. The format of this discussion will be question and answer style. I will ask a specific panelist a question. When they have completed their thought, I will open up the floor to any other guests to give their thoughts on the question. I would ask that our guests be mindful of our time constraints, but feel free to share their opinions and points of view. Energy issues and policies have been a leading topic of discussion for many years now. Within those issues, energy security has become to the forefront of those policy discussions. The International Energy Agency defines energy security as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. The IEA continues with its description by stating, energy security has many aspects. Long-term energy security mainly deals with the timely investment to supply energy in line with economic developments and environmental needs. On the other hand, short-term energy security focuses on the ability of the energy system to react promptly to sudden changes in the supply-demand balance. I will begin our discussion by asking our panel to prioritize the following national energy policy issues, from greatest concern to the one that they feel is of least priority. Number 1, national security. 2, competitive markets. 3, the environment. 4, climate change. 5, consumer equity. And 6, free market pricing. Mr. Pollard, we will start with you. From the list, what would you choose as a priority from greatest to least? Please highlight your top and bottom choices.
Thanks, Drew. It's a difficult task to prioritize such important issues concerning energy policy. I will start by highlighting my top and bottom, as you have asked. Then I will give a general overview of what Griffin advocates as the right solution for such a matter as this. My top issues will be split between national security and the environment, as the two go hand in hand regarding any energy policy. While my bottom choice is free market pricing, we need to create and keep a competitive, fair market and continue to avoid monopolization. The perfect energy policy should be cheap, clean, and secure. Unfortunately, the cheapest is not always the cleanest or the most secure. In fact, the cheapest may not always even be the cheapest. Most fossil fuels do not reflect their true social cost, which is they do not include the cost of environmental damage they create or the cost it takes to secure the resource. The best way to create a balanced energy policy would be to implement an oil security tax for each barrel of oil and a carbon tax per ton of CO2 emissions. This would level the playing field for more expensive alternative resources to compete and be developed naturally through a competitive market. Now, Drew, to refer back to your list of issues, and forgive me for altering your question a bit, I believe all of these issues are very important and should be considered very carefully when creating an energy policy. Rather than listing them top to bottom, I will list each one and how it would be impacted under Griffin's proposed plan. 1. Help increase security by offsetting the cost of emergency storage reserves with the oil security tax. 2. A carbon tax would level the playing field for new technologies to be developed and relying on a competitive market to determine the winner, not the government. 3. The environment, and 4. Climate change. Carbon remains in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, making it impossible for consumers today to see the benefits of what they are paying for. With emissions predicted to grow at substantial rates, Griffin's proposed carbon tax would increase slightly year to year, making long-term capital planning better and having less of an impact on consumers today. This approach would lead to a long-term change that over time would eliminate high CO2 emissions, therefore limiting the effects of climate change to our environment. 5. Consumer equity. I covered briefly in competitive markets. The implementation of a carbon tax would allow the consumer to determine the winners. Where consumers ultimately spend their money will take much of the decision-making ability away from politicians and special interest groups and let the market decide which technologies are in fact the best. And finally, 6. Free market pricing. I chose earlier as the bottom of the list because although market prices will fluctuate from supply and demand, they fail to fully reward clean and secure energy. That is why the previous steps I discussed must be implemented to show the true cost in order to level the playing field. We have an endless supply of energy, but we must focus on getting the prices right in order for future development in new technologies to be economically viable. This will create more of an interest for investors to invest in the extensive research and development that is needed in these new areas.
Mr. Johnston, how would you organize this list? And why did you choose your highest and lowest priority?
Thank you for the question, Drew. The most important aspect of our nation's energy policy development centers on national security and our ability to ensure the safety of all American citizens. Oil has a clear monopoly over our transportation fuels, and many of the nations providing our oil clearly wish us harm and pose a clear danger to America and our Western existence. With the rise of radical Islamic terrorism, there exists a perpetual instability in the Middle East and parts of Africa. Terrorists threaten oil facilities and tankers that operate in that region. They are a constant reminder that our oil supply and our way of life is vulnerable. The fact that OPEC members sit on roughly 78% of the world's oil reserves is a chilling fact. It has also been shown that many members of these nations rich in natural resources do a very poor job of reinvesting that wealth into their own economy. This creates a large gap between the rich and poor. Despite claims by several Middle Eastern governments to cut terrorist financing, the wealth generated by those same countries continues to flow to those organizations that seek to eradicate us. We are in fact indirectly funding those same radical groups who brought down the Twin Towers on 9/11. America is stuck in a vicious cycle in which we are fighting an ideology that is growing stronger every day, with American petrodollars lining their pockets and filling their weapons with ammunition. The two most threatening nations to our national security are clearly Iran and Saudi Arabia. They represent two different sects of Islam. Iran promotes radical Shiites and Saudi Arabia promotes radical Sunnis. Both sects have an intense hatred for each other, but pale to the deep-seated hatred they have for the West. Iran has turned the clock back to create a medieval society where they hang homosexuals, women virtually have no rights, government opposition is tortured and dismembered, and death by stoning is carried out regularly. Let us not forget about Saudi Arabia. An often overlooked fact is that 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudi nationals. This is no coincidence. The Saudi Arabian Wahhabi sect of Islam, funded by our petrodollars, graduate roughly 100,000 young boys every year from some 12,000 Islamic institutions. Those institutions brainwash their peoples to hate Westerners, Christians, Jews, and all non-Islams that are turning each child into a mini weapon of mass destruction. In spite of all this, our government's response is to continue to import large amounts of oil while providing virtually nothing in regards to exports to those nations. This has created a large trade disparity and shift in power away from America. The transfer of wealth from oil consumers, America, to oil exporting countries is a problem that must be solved by our policymakers.
Very interesting and provocative comments. Ms. Gaspar, how would you categorize this list?
Drew, first I would like to thank you for having us on behalf of the Deutsch Group. There are many pressing issues surrounding energy policy, and platforms such as this forum afford us the right environment in which to address these issues, especially the national energy policy issues you have asked us to prioritize in your question. In addressing this question, I would first like to speak on the overall energy challenge from a broader scope, and then lead into the more specific issues contained in the question. Deutsch remarks that ultimately, the energy challenge is how best to satisfy reasonable demand with secure, affordable sources of supply without unduly harming the environment. Balancing secure, affordable sources of energy supply without harming the environment is a convoluted problem, in that it seeks to attain conflicting goals through conflicting means. Most basically, affordable sources of energy supply are currently fossil fuels, which harm the environment. Additionally, the issue of security surrounding energy supply further complicates the energy issue due to geopolitical concerns and conflicts. Energy policy proves to be more narrowly challenging in that 1. There exists a linkage between domestic and international considerations regarding all energy issues, and 2. Significant energy policy change requires that technical, economic, and political factors applicable to energy policy be effectively and efficiently integrated. Therefore, it is extremely difficult to prioritize one of the aforementioned focus areas over another, as all of these topics are interrelated and additionally all carry significant weight in regard to energy policy. However, having to rank these particular factors on a level of importance, I would prioritize the following: 1. Climate change, 2. National security, and 3. Availability of affordable energy and the encouragement of energy innovation. I prioritize these 3 issues for the following reasons. Climate change is at the foreground of energy policy. The past decade has afforded climate change the opportunity to move to the forefront of important and controversial energy issues. The emission of greenhouse gases, or GHGs, increases the concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere. This subsequent increase in concentration increases global temperatures, affecting climate and leading to adverse effects upon environmental, economic, and social activity. Regarding the issue of climate change, it is imperative the following key issues be addressed: the validity of the science, the action that is necessary to be taken today, and how the cost of these actions should be shared among developed and developing countries. Deutsch comments that the climate issue illustrates the complex interaction between selecting technical options to reduce emissions, crafting a policy that balances differing political interests with economic incentives that will encourage change, and negotiating an international agreement that harmonizes the policies of developed and developing countries. The importance of national energy security and energy policy is twofold. 1. Import dependence constrains the leverage of the United States in all foreign policy matters, and 2. Energy dependence is an unrealistic goal, and the United States must prepare to manage the consequences of our oil dependence, as well as our allies' oil dependence in our foreign policy. Lastly, the availability of affordable energy and the encouragement of energy innovation is an essential stepping stone in energy policy moving forward. There is a great opportunity coupled with a grave challenge in implementing new energy technology. Innovation leads the way for new energy technology. However, the rapidity in which it is discovered and implemented is dependent upon the foresight of government policy and efforts put forth by the management of government and industry technology development.
Mr. Abdafar, your thoughts?
Let me start by saying thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate in this forum. I would just like to reiterate what my colleague Lee has already pointed out. We must put energy security at the forefront of any national energy policy. As Lee mentioned, one of the most threatening nations to our national security is Iran. And when examining what Iran has been able to do in recent years, the need for energy security is deepened. Due to Iran's refining capacity, it imports more than 40% of its gasoline. As an effort to protect against this vulnerability, Iran has initiated a plan to convert its vehicles to run on compressed natural gas, rather than gasoline. Given that Iran has the second largest natural gas reserve in the world, this move can guarantee uninterrupted supply of cheap transportation fuel for a long time. Although there are environmental and economic gains from this move, the underlying motive is purely strategic. The move to natural gas will allow Iran to produce larger quantities of non-gasoline petroleum products like jet fuel and diesel, both key to keeping the Iranian Air Force, Army, and Navy powered. The U.S. must recognize the threats surrounding energy and put energy security as a top priority of its national energy policy. Thank you.
Sir, since we have you talking, please give us your thoughts on what measures are most effective in promoting energy security.
Thank you, Drew. I would be glad to. To truly be effective in promoting energy security, we need to be serious about what is used here in the United States for transportation fuel. We need to ensure that all new vehicles have a flex fuel option and that the infrastructure to fuel these vehicles is present. We must break away from the monopoly petroleum has on U.S. transportation. Now, for those of you who think this can't be accomplished, take Brazil for example. Brazil imported 80% of its oil supply 3 decades ago, and in a relatively short period of time it was able to be energy independent. How did Brazil accomplish this? Brazil has shifted to a fleet of flex fuel vehicles that can run on any combination of gasoline or alcohol. Unlike biofuel vehicles, such as those that can utilize natural gas, which have separate tanks for fuel and allow engines to only run on one at a time, flex fuel vehicles have one tank in which different fuels mix. The vehicles can run on gasoline or ethanol or a mix of both. This allows the consumer to choose, depending on cost and personal preference, how much gasoline versus alcohol to put in their vehicles. The success of this was made possible early on by ensuring at least one ethanol pump available in most fueling stations in Brazil. Brazil was successful in breaking the petroleum monopoly by introducing fuel market to competition. As a result, when the world is facing an oil crisis, Brazil's transportation infrastructure is economically resilient due to the ability to shift to other fuel sources. So can this be done in the United States? And if so, how? The fundamental shift is to make vehicles platforms on which fuels can compete. Currently, there are 17.4 million flex fuel vehicles in use in the United States. This is the second largest flex fuel fleet in the world after Brazil. Although this number is growing, it is dwarfed in comparison to the more than 200 million vehicles in the United States overall fleet. The United States must start by requiring that all new cars sold in the U.S. have the ability to use gasoline, ethanol, and methanol. With a cost of less than $100 per car, there isn't a reason that every new car built should not have a flex fuel option. U.S. automakers have already been producing flex fuel cars in small quantities for the American market. We now need a policy requiring them to produce all new vehicles with the same options. We have policies requiring seatbelts and airbags to protect our lives, and rearview mirrors to help our field of vision, and even laws that every car sold is able to receive an FM transmission so that we can stay informed in times of crisis. We now need an open fuel standard requiring all new cars sold to have a flex fuel option, which can protect our lives and our economy. Increasing the amount of flex fuel vehicles is half the battle. The actual use of ethanol fuel is limited due to the lack of E85 fueling infrastructure. According to the EIA, as of March 2014, only 2% of all retail stations in the United States offer E85. This is serving the approximate 5% of the U.S. light-duty vehicle fleet capable of running E85. The number of E85 fueling stations in the United States almost doubled between 2007 to 2011, but has only increased by 7% from 2011 to 2013. The reason most gas stations are not retrofitting their pumps, a cost which is mostly covered by tax incentives, is that the pumps would take up valuable retail space. With such a small percentage of vehicles on the road being flex fuel vehicles, it does not make financial sense to build the infrastructure to support them. Since flex fuel vehicles, like non-flex fuel vehicles, run on gasoline, there is no inconvenience for the vehicle owners due to the lack of E85 fueling stations. This presents somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. The solution is to ensure that any new car being built is a flex fuel vehicle. Once 15 to 20% of vehicles on the road in an area can utilize flex fuels, this will incentivize gas stations to offer the flex fuel option and allow the fueling stations to catch up. If the United States truly wants to promote energy security, it must start by enacting the open fuel standard so that new cars put on the road today are fully equipped to face the oil crisis of tomorrow. With such a low cost and high benefit, the choice is obvious. We must make energy security a priority, and to do so, we must ensure our transportation fleet is resilient to any one fuel catastrophe. Thank you.
Does one of our other panelists have a follow-up?
Thank you, Bayad. You made some great points regarding this topic. You've actually touched upon important factors surrounding energy security, innovation, and a long-term transition from dependence on fossil fuels. Energy import levels are extremely important in regards to national security. From a national security perspective, import dependence influences foreign policy, both directly and indirectly, as energy is used as an instrument of geopolitical power. Therefore, shifting from fossil fuels, both foreign and domestic, to other sources of energy will enable the U.S. to decrease its import dependence and subsequently strengthen national security. Further, it is essential that we strengthen the federal government's efforts to encourage energy innovation. It is through innovation that we are better able to establish energy independence, which fosters a stronger national security.
Mr. Pollard, you stated earlier in your answer to my first question that the world has an endless supply of energy. I'd like you to explain that statement.
Yes, sir, and thank you for circling back to this comment, as it's a driving force behind the plan Griffin proposes. It is true, there will always be energy available as long as someone is willing to pay for it. The challenge we are facing is the technical ability to capture and deliver other sources of energy to the consumer at an economically competitive price to fossil fuels. This is why we need to focus and define one goal for our energy policy, and that is a goal to balance cheap, clean, and secure energy. Applying a security tax to a barrel of oil and a carbon tax per ton of CO2 emissions created, as I mentioned earlier, would elevate the prices of fossil fuels, reflecting their true social cost for each resource. This would make it possible for otherwise more expensive alternatives to become economically competitive. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and contrary to the public perception created by politicians and the media, there is not a perfect solution that can eliminate fossil fuels anytime in the near future. Griffin's theory is to create a policy that will work towards long-term solutions.
So we're not facing a shortage of energy. We're facing a technical challenge in capturing and delivering it to consumers. With energy always being available at some price, does this alleviate the need to create further energy security policies? And is our current political structure adequate for this process?
Fortunately, the answers are no and no. The energy industry is always in a constant state of change, thus we will always have the need to adapt our policies to encompass these changes in order to ensure the security of our energy sources. However, there are ways in which we can reduce the dependence on insecure energy, particularly oil, by adding more secure sources to the mix. That way, If there is a disturbance in the production, for example in the Middle East, by having more producing countries in the supply mix, this would reduce the impact of that disruption. That, along with the development of alternative resources and investment in emergency reserves, would all go a long way in increasing the security of our energy. Although we have a unique and detailed process in place for creating policies for both the federal and state government, it has many flaws. There have been too many mishmash policies implemented to solve one problem while creating another. We would be better off to construct a new policy altogether that focuses on accomplishing the same goal. This should be drafted by experts in the area and not by politicians and special interest groups who lack industry knowledge.
Ms. Gaspara, I have read The Crisis in Energy Policy, and I have a question for you. If natural gas truly is cleaner burning, and it is seemingly endless in supply, why don't we just convert all the coal to gas and reduce the CO2 emissions? It would seem like the ideal solution. Also, while we're talking about CO2 emissions, let's go ahead and point out the 3-ton gorilla in the room. It's something that is being hotly debated: climate change. Thus far, we've talked about a lot about technology. Can technology and innovation help us simultaneously address both goals: climate change mitigation and energy independence? And if so, how and when?
In addressing this very complex and multifaceted question, I would like to begin by elaborating upon climate change and the issues it encompasses, as well as energy independence and matters pertaining to it. As I discussed in my opening statement regarding key energy policy factors, climate change is an extremely pertinent and contentious issue as of late. There exist 3 methods in which to counteract the adverse effects of greenhouse gas emissions. They are as follows: 1. Reduce global emissions. 2. Learning to adapt to the changes in climate. Or 3. Taking active measures to counteract the warming trend. Climate change policy has particularly involved the first, reducing global emissions. However, the debate surrounding reducing global emissions is a difficult one because it requires deciding to what extent these reductions should involve developed countries, like the United States, and developing countries, like China and India. Climate change is a perfect microcosm for public policy. It involves a complicated technical problem in which the solution requires vast resources, international cooperation, and consistent action over many years by industry and government. The international community has failed to extend the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at Rio de Janeiro and the Kyoto Protocol of December 1992. The International Panel on Climate Change is responsible for the socioeconomic and technical evaluation of information applicable to risks surrounding human-induced climate change. There exists strong scientific consensus that the continued emission of greenhouse gases from human activity will lead to climate change and cause adverse effects upon the global ecology and human welfare. So again, the question is posed to the international community of how much of emissions reduction is the developed world responsible for and how much is the developing world responsible for. The Kaya relation is an identity whose equation addresses this issue. The equation states that the percentage increase in carbon emissions between any selected initial and final period must equal the percentage increase in GDP between these 2 periods plus the percentage change in carbon per unit GDP. The Kaya relation helpfully identifies the restricted range of choices that a country faces in achieving carbon reduction targets and the significant differences in choices likely to be made by different countries, such as the United States and China. The way in which reductions occur is through regulation or through economic response given a significant emissions charge is imposed, referencing, of course, either an emissions tax or a better cap and trade system. A tax on emissions is an alternative mechanism to Obama's cap and trade system that could be structured to give an equivalent emission outcome. Further, the availability of and the advancements in technology like carbon capture and sequestration needed to advance these reductions is extremely uncertain given the nature of the development efforts of the United States government. In addition, climate policy on both a domestic and international level faces three challenges in particular. 1. Unrealistic goals and reduction targets based upon unrealistic hopes surrounding technology and policy. 2. Uncertainty surrounding technology and its advancements. And 3. High capital costs involved in that technology. Now that I have summarized and elaborated upon climate change, I would like to address energy independence. Energy independence deserves similar attention to that of climate change, especially in relation to energy security. It is very difficult to address energy security and, in such, energy independence in autonomously economic terms regarding supply and demand issues, particularly. More broadly and importantly, import dependence influences foreign policy both directly and indirectly on the consuming country side as well as on the producing country side. With regard to the consuming country, foreign policy positions, leverage, and relationships are biased, whereas on the producing country side, their influence capacity and options are biased. This has turned oil into a tool of geopolitical power. Therefore, from a national security perspective, a reduction in oil imports is imperative, and the implementation of government policies to achieve those reductions is important moving forward. This policy is significant on a much broader scale as well, as it simultaneously works towards a much broader and long-term goal of shifting dependence away from fossil fuels, both domestic and foreign. Hence, placing grave emphasis upon innovation and technology. Innovation in energy supply technology is extremely challenging and demanding. Further, it is both complex and difficult to deploy new sources of energy supply. This is because this deployment involves technical, political, and economic elements, and this progress depends upon commonsensical and consistent government policy. Therefore, in regard to innovation and technology surrounding the energy industry and climate change and energy independence in particular, it is essential to focus on how to best manage technical innovation. The DOE's role in managing energy innovation should stretch far beyond basic research and early technology development. The difficulty in this challenge surrounds how best for the DOE to encourage commercialization of new energy technologies. Private enterprise is slow in the deployment of new energy technology due to the high amount of risk involved. Therefore, the DOE should emphasize the demonstration of technical performance, economics, and environmental effects of alternative technologies, consequently illustrating to the private sector technology options to pursue or not. Deutsch notes, in fact, energy innovation is constrained not by an absence of new ideas, but by the absence of early examples of successful implementation. Government action to improve the situation requires both more resources and a willingness to change the conventional approach to government support for energy technology commercialization. Market-driven technology innovation is vital for steady and stable progress in implementing cost-efficient and effective solutions to energy supply and demand needs, as well as to issues of climate change. There are three critical steps defined by Deutsch for the DOE in which to employ surrounding energy innovation. 1. Continue the DOE's support of the early stage innovation process. 2. The key transition from laboratory scale research to development and possible demonstration requires disciplined management based on explicit analysis. And 3. Congress should create an energy technology corporation to manage demonstration projects.
Would anyone like to make a comment on her statements?
Drew, I would like to comment on this one if you don't mind. Caddy, you made some great points, and thank you so much for your insight. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate and build upon a couple points I made in my answer to Drew's first question, as I feel it is a great way to accomplish some of these difficult points you've brought up. If we started with a very modest carbon tax per ton of CO2 emissions, there would not be a severe impact right away on consumer prices. This tax could increase at 4% annum plus the overall inflation rate. Consequently, the tax rate would double in 18 years and quadruple in 36 years. A plan like this would have a low short-term impact at a low cost to consumers and allow future investment decisions and planning to current and future infrastructure the ability to plan ahead the overall cost it will eventually take to operate. Coupled with the carbon tax, we should implement a security tax per barrel of oil in order to reflect the true social cost of the resource. Adding these two taxes would make further research and development of alternative fuels more economic and attract greater interest for investment. This does not necessarily solve the international problem you pointed out. However, it could be an example to the rest of the world, and as a result, other countries adopting a similar plan.
Justin and Caddy make some good points. However, technology and innovation can help climate change, but we must shift the way we think of carbon dioxide. We need to start thinking of carbon dioxide as a raw material that can be made into a usable product instead of trying to find ways to dump carbon dioxide at high costs. As illustrated by Luff and Corin, one method where technology can make this possible is by converting carbon dioxide into methanol. According to Professor George Olaf, if carbon dioxide is heated to 1700 degrees Celsius, it split the carbon monoxide and oxygen, at which point the carbon monoxide can be converted into hydrocarbons. Another technology that can utilize carbon dioxide is the use of algae. Algae requires a large amount of carbon dioxide to grow. Once harvested, algae starches can be made into ethanol, biodiesel, and jet fuel. Isaac Berzin, a leading algae expert, explains that every stage of algae growth and production reduces carbon emission and limits dependency on foreign oil, and each stage is profitable. Methods such as these that treat carbon dioxide as a raw material can help mitigate climate change while securing energy independence. Thank you.
The tight oil and shale oil has been a game changer for North American hydrocarbon production. In fact, many circles are claiming this revolution has set the United States up for being energy independent. Mr. Johnston, I'd like to hear your thoughts on if energy independence is a realistic goal for the United States. If so, why is it important and how could it be achieved?
Energy independence is absolutely a realistic goal of the United States. Right now, we are energy dependent, but with the correct energy policy in place to make the necessary transitions, energy independence could be on the horizon. It is vital we begin the necessary steps immediately because this is not something that can be necessarily carried out overnight. We must alter aspects of our thought and infrastructure to make way for our future as a safer, more secure nation. As detailed in a 2006 testimony by the Secretary of State at the time, Condoleezza Rice, the United States must act on our energy problem. She notes our addiction to oil is warping diplomacy worldwide and giving extraordinary power to nations who misuse that power. However, we must first understand this meaning of energy independence if we are to take steps to get there. Energy independence does not mean being completely self-sufficient in our own oil supply. Our supply is very limited. The United States sits on roughly 3% of the world's conventional oil reserves. In spite of my previous points made regarding the U.S. pumping petrodollars into the Middle East, we receive only 1/8 of our oil supply from that region. However, over 2/3 of the U.S. oil consumption is due to the transportation industry, and out of that 2/3, 97% of the energy is oil-based. With the world being a global marketplace, if we do not buy that oil, someone else will. A true state of energy independence surrounds the aforementioned ability to replace the monopoly that oil has over the transportation fuels and give us alternatives to power our vehicles. We must transition to alternative fuels, and automakers must provide us with the vehicles to utilize those fuel sources. Oil is a very unique product. Let me tell you why. First, humans and goods rely on it to move around the world and do virtually every task on a day-to-day basis. Second, the nature of the countries that hold such a huge amount of its reserves tend to be unstable. Third, it is not traded freely, but rather controlled by a cartel. We must free ourselves from the grasp of those unfriendly countries and stand on our own 2 feet. This will give us the freedom to act as leaders in the geopolitical world rather than having to cower in fear of economic repercussions. We have been forced to endure brutal friendships with nations whose leaders have committed crimes against humanity, free and clear from fear or justice or any persecution. I detailed at length the national security danger that many of these Middle Eastern and African nations possess. These countries have taken away our voice and our backbone. Immediately following 9/11, a plane full of Saudi Arabians, which included members of the bin Laden family, were allowed to leave the U.S. to avoid FBI questioning. There's also been a direct link of financial support from the Saudi royal family to Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. What about the missing 28 pages in the congressional report highlighting Saudi Arabia's role in the 9/11 attacks? These are just several instances pointing toward our deteriorating global image in the face of commodity dependence. Energy independence will undoubtedly not stop terror or radicals from committing acts against the West. It could, however, decrease those nations and groups' resources to further fund their cause. It is clear this is not a supply and demand problem. It is a problem of oil having too much value to humans. As soon as we can begin to stem the tide on oil's value to our everyday lives, we'll be on the path to true energy independence.
An email question came in asking the panel's view on the current downturn in the oil market. I will direct that question to Mr. Pollard, but I'd also like to take that a step further and ask you about energy commodities in general. Being commodities and their cyclic nature, what bearing does it have on energy security policy? And what can be done to stabilize the market?
That's a great question, Drew. I'll answer this one using the bathtub analogy devised from MIT professor Morris Adelman that Griffin likes to use to describe the world oil market. First, imagine the world as one giant bathtub. Each oil-producing country is a faucet that fills this tub, while every country that consumes oil is a drain out of this tub. If there is any disturbance with one or more of the faucets, it will create a price shock to the world oil market. Using this analogy and comparing it to the current downturn in the market, you will see that the flow from the faucets has been turned up, while the drains are not pulling enough away from the bathtub to keep the level balanced. Oil prices will undoubtedly remain volatile. However, Griffin believes there are ways to reduce the major fluctuations in the market and increase the security of the global oil market by first adding more faucets to the bathtub. This would be more beneficial in a tight oil market as though it would decrease the impact of disruptions to one of the faucets and significantly reduce the probability of disruption to world oil supplies. Second, reduce withdrawals from the bathtub, and third, globalizing the bathtub. In order to stabilize the market, we must think about oil security from a worldwide perspective rather than an individual country perspective. Daniel Yergin states several principles for maintenance of energy security, one of which is recognizing the reality of integration. There is only one oil market. For all consumers, security resides in the stability of this market. Succession is not an option.
Would anyone else like to comment?
I would like to make a comment if you don't mind. You stated oil as being a global commodity, correct? Why not push for the same goals that Bayat and I have reinforced on a worldwide scale? The collusion that exists between OPEC nations is no secret. It also does not appear that OPEC itself is going away anytime soon. There is also no chance of the resources they sit on migrating from under their feet. Instead, take away OPEC's power to maintain an unstable market by taking away the value of the product they control. If the United States could be an example of leading the charge of alternative fuels for the transportation industry, imagine how impactful that could be on a global scale. Ambitious? Yes, but it is a powerful idea. Human ingenuity has never ceased to amaze, so why stop now?
Well, that about wraps it up for this forum on energy policy. Would any of our esteemed panelists like to make any closing remarks?
Drew, I would like to thank you for the excellent job you did moderating this event, and thank you to the rest of the panel for such insightful information regarding some of the most difficult issues we are currently facing. One last thing before we go. Drew, from your perspective as the moderator, what were the biggest takeaways from tonight's discussion?
Well, Mr. Pollard, thank you for throwing the moderator under the proverbial bus. You do know that I'm only here to keep the peace and to make jokes. Apparently I was good at keeping the peace, but not so great at throwing out the jokes. It may be because I take these subjects extremely serious. Heck, I didn't even make a crack about me living in North Dakota and asking why global warming is truly such a bad thing. As you're aware, I come from an energy background, primarily oil, gas, and coal. So the discussion of U.S. energy policy is near and dear to my heart. As you are also aware, I've been called many things in my life. But one name that ranks just below that of daddy and husband is that of a United States Marine. With this combination, I cannot help myself from being overly concerned about the energy security of the United States and our allies. Unfortunately, I have also developed a mistrust and angst for those in power. Are they truly doing what is good for this nation, or are they merely pandering to what is popular and vogue at the time? Throughout this discussion, the one thing that really stood out in my mind was that the availability of energy does not seem to be the problem. The problem is energy technology. Technological advances would cure these issues that we discussed today, and I feel that it is a basket that we should be investing our dollars in. Okay, well, it looks like we're out of time. I'd like to thank my guests and the audience for participating in this event. We hope that it was enjoyable and enlightening. Good night.